If the land is well and the water is well, the people will thrive. And really that brings it to a head. What's happening in SWWIM is probably something that's happening around the world. We're realising how connected everything is. Good things start in SWWIM. I whakapapa to SWWIM. And up there is my great-grandfather, who dairying is in our blood. He was the chair of the Christchurch Central Dairy Company between 1894, get my centuries right, and 1917, so 23 years. And my grandfather was born at Deep Spring in Leaston, so not very far from here. And when my great-grandfather was chair of the dairy company, they also patented the Fernleaf brand. So probably a little bit of responsibility in my genes for some of the things that were started here with the conversion of arable farms to dairy. But it's been a long trip, 150 years of dairy, and probably in the last 20 years, as we're seeing with these graphs, is when we've seen the real rapid intensification. So it's not just a SWWIM problem, the spillover is something that we're seeing globally. So if we think about planetary boundaries, we've breached the planetary boundary for nitrogen with what the Earth can cope with by 5 times. Okay, and our rate of biodiversity loss is just happening at an alarming rate. But in New Zealand, we've still, as far as I can understand, we've still got an agricultural growth agenda operating. We're still subsidising more irrigation and more intensification on vulnerable soils. It's understandable that the locals were getting a little bit upset when Kent Central Plains water was consented, and that's actually a real sign. I didn't make it up, but on one of the overbridges here in Canterbury about 5 years ago, when I think the hearings were on, Central Plains water polluting our groundwater for the next 50 years. Someone, somewhere, had responsibility. And there's a responsibility there because the consent was granted in 2012, or after being applied for in 2002, at a point where actually the groundwater report showed quite clearly that there were elevating nitrate trends in the groundwater in 29% of those regions. The issue is that our central and local governments believe that growth is linear and it's limitless, and that there's no environmental effects from it. We don't measure the cost of pollution. We chase GDP. GDP is basically the effect of any plan change or anything that happens at a regional level is tested for GDP. GDP measures the number of jobs and gross turnover. It doesn't measure human health, well-being, scientific integrity and community well-being. The issue is it's not straight line. Biological systems like the land that we work with and on farms, basically we've got 3 biological systems. We've got land, water and land, people and animals. And actually, as you intensify things, it's certainly not a straight line. You can put more cows on, you don't get more milk. It gets to an optimum point and then it starts just plateauing off. As you keep intensifying though, what you do get is a big rapid spike in the environmental effects, and the cost to fix those environmental effects get very significant beyond a certain stocking rate or beyond a certain level of inputs. So we don't get a straight line of increased profit. And the issue is that our farmers are actually pushed to produce more. So our main dairy processor is building certainly more capacity, there's more stainless steel, and there's a need for that business model to have more growth and more output. But in reality, profitability on farm doesn't necessarily come from more production. So what's good for the processor isn't necessarily good for the farmer. So we've got a conflict. And as you've seen with what Russell's presented and also with what Alistair's presented, the nitrate levels across the whole of New Zealand are showing increasing trends. And 95% of the nitrogen load in this catchment is from farming. And we understand, and actually there's a nice glossy brochure saying that we can still expect another 40% increase in the nitrogen load already making its way to the lake. Unfortunately, this is going to take 10 to 60 years to emerge. And the farmers across the catchment have been effectively allocated a nitrogen loss right according to what their historical nitrogen level was. So it's grandparenting effectively, which I think Rick might touch on a little bit more later. The issue is that also when they consented the Central Plains Water Scheme, even the modelling in 2011-2012 did show that there was going to be a 25% increase in the groundwater level for nitrate at the time. Russell's covered this, basically, and Alistair covered this as well. It's not just farm animals, it actually tends to be female farm animals because they tend to stand in one place when they urinate, and apparently the bulls walk around, so you do get a benefit from masculinising the farm animals. But I haven't quite worked out how to do that apart from rearing more bobby calves on dairy farms. The other issue is that certainly phosphorus and pathogens, phosphorus tends to run across the land, as Russell said, but pathogens we're understanding on gravelly soils, of which a lot of your dairying is on, 70% of it's on coarse soils. You'll get pathogen transfer through coarse soils as well as across coarse soils. And then the other issue is that some of the bugs actually can last quite a long time in groundwater and make their way to drinking water sources. So those sort of pathways across disturbed soil, running off with phosphorus, you'll see the pathogens, and the ones that I'm concerned about is the vetch, which transfer to humans, are the zoonotic pathogens. So ones that have animals as their hosts, they survive in faeces, and some of them are transferred from cow urine as well through to people. So we do have to worry about them as well as nitrogen. And some of them we actually can't measure with just a straight E. coli test, things like leptospirosis, yersiniosis, and some of the protozoa, of course. So as Alistair touched on the Havelock North inquiry, where it was basically traced back to what the paddock activities were, we've got this connectivity happening. This is a picture of somewhere in Manawatu, Vinegar Hill, and actually you'll see that's a of intensive farming with a river going around the edge there. Winter cropping, intensive stocking, rotational grazing on quite gravelly, leaky soils. But the runoff that occurs from that intensive cropping, which is a permitted activity, is also just upstream of the Hunterville water supply. So we have to think about what we're doing in those paddocks and how it connects through the barriers and the potential systems through to people. And actually the national environmental standards, which actually sit above the regional policy or the regional plans, basically have a obligation in there that there's no permitted activities above drinking water sources or takes. So we have to think about what we're doing on the land actually, where water is taken downstream or from an unconfined aquifer. So getting on to really what's happening in agriculture, and this is a big picture that really we've got a whole lot of change coming, and it's not just a problem in Selwyn. And when a baby's coming or when something's being delivered, you can't actually stop it. And we've got this sort of change facing us in agriculture. The horse went to the car. Nylon or synthetics replaced wool from the 50s through to the 70s, and now we've got potential for non-animal proteins to replace our animal proteins. So hen-free eggs, moo-free milk, or basically beef-free meat. And it's a bit of a concern because it's happening really quickly. These products are able to be either produced from stem cells with probably, so if you think about stem cells being produced into meat, we'd actually only need a global population of 35,000 beef animals to produce the cells that we need to feed the global population demand for meat right at the moment. So it's big challenges coming and coming down quite rapidly in cost. So we've got volatility facing our farmers. They're really challenged at the moment with volatility for their commodity prices, but also from climatic volatility. We've got the challenge for farmers all around the country dealing with how to keep their businesses profitable with these changes, and also just developing what is a resilient business. Is it slightly diversified? Is it looking to tourism? Is it looking at a range of different businesses on their land and integrating them? So diversification and integration. But for farmers to make those changes, they actually need support, and we haven't got a lot of good research in New Zealand about how to change farms or how to transition from one type of farming, say dairy, through to a range of different businesses on that farm. So our farmers do need support. We've got the disruptive technologies coming, as I spoke about. You know, the car replaced the horse, synthetic carpets, and our non-animal proteins. And these non-animal proteins potentially have a 95% lower ecological footprint. So the educated consumer is actually making choices about these. We've got the challenge of ecological overshoot, as I said, and this catchment is a real challenge because we've got the nitrogen bomb here. There's not a hell of a lot we can do about it. What do we do on the land? And potentially we can do things around lightening our footprint with fewer cows, which we'll talk about, but in some cases we are going to have to see land use change, and that's what we're dealing with in the Rotorua catchment at the moment. We've also got the challenge of antibiotic resistance, and the reason I'm bringing that in, it's again that human and animal link. So by 2050, they expect that there'll be 10 million deaths per year, and I know this sounds quite morbid, from antibiotic-resistant organisms, which is going to overtake cancer deaths. But our challenge at the moment in agriculture is that probably over half of all our antibiotics brought into New Zealand are used in agriculture, and a lot of them for prevention. Of course, pigs and poultry are one of the bigger users, but the dairy industry is quite a reasonable user as well. We've got to move by 2030 to 2040 to greatly reduce our antibiotic use on farm. So that'll mean we'll have to move, and this is another pressure, it's really difficult to manage those intensive house systems without antibiotics in there to stop the spread of disease. We've also got the challenge for our farmers about welfare. We're moving from this perception of a bottom line for welfare to actually what is it for the animal? Is it having a good life? And is that life worth living? So a completely different approach from consumers putting pressure on our farmers. So in the past we used to produce more and think the market was going to take it, and now it's all about being, what does a consumer think, consumer-driven, focused on how they think those animals have been treated. So it's all part of the story that's going to put pressure on our farms. It's not just the nitrogen reduction story. So just have a look at these numbers, because these are the regional plans right around the country. You'll see that SWWIM's not alone in having to drop nitrogen levels. So admittedly, the farms in this catchment have been grandparented with an old allocation according to what they were doing, and there has to be, say for dairy, a 30% drop, or show that they can do a 30% drop after 2022 through to a later stage, 2030 or something, in terms of reducing nitrogen. But where I'm doing a lot of work in the Bay of Plenty, the farmers there in the lakes catchment have to drop by 40% by 2032 from their start point. Hawke's Bay, they've got to meet land use capability limits. Horizons, 25% drop over 20 years, and Ashburton and Hines as well. They've got to have good management practices in place now and drop a further 30%. So what are our solutions? New Zealand's got to have a really good story and a really legitimate story. So for our agricultural products, we have to tell not only a good story, but have a really, really legitimate scaffold about our claims. So is it possible that by 2025, New Zealand can be the farmers' market of the global village and have a great brand that's underpinned by the claims of pure New Zealand? The other thing is that we've probably got, and I firmly believe we do need to stop converting more vulnerable landscapes. hey, it's not just cows that are getting a hard time. We've got new residential zones in Wellington where they're not wanting cats, so we've got cat clawback, cat capping. We're wondering, already? Okay. In Hawke's Bay, they're talking about some of those areas where they're taking the drinking water from, that there might have to be animal-free aquifers where they've got drinking water sources being taken from. So we've got a lot of disruption and change. The other thing is that it might not just be about reducing or going to slightly fewer cows. We may have to look at quite significant land use change over time, but farmers will need to be supported for that. If you have a look at this, if we grew wheat, for example, under an irrigation system, because I'm comparing irrigated dairy in here, irrigated dairy in Canterbury, for example, use about 5.5 million to 6.5 million litres per hectare to produce around 20,000 litres of milk per hectare, whereas wheat would take a whole lot less. But right at the moment, we don't have those market chains well developed to be able to make that sudden transition. But look at all the difference and the difference in the resource use between that energy and protein production per hectare. It's significant. There are a lot of farmers all around the country really trying to lead change, and I've worked with a lot of farmers in different catchments. There's certainly the stocking rate story, an opportunity to reduce numbers. Certainly in the Waikato, the study I did, and in Waipa, you could drop cow numbers by about 20 to 30%. Over time, of course, and then adapt those cows to produce more per cow. So we had no less production per hectare. I understand Lincoln's done something quite similar. I see Ron's in the audience there, and he'd be able to explain it in more detail, but Lincoln's done a similar thing with reducing cow numbers and getting more per cow, dropping the nitrogen leaching by 20 to 30%, and still remaining profitable. So there is some really good stories around the country around this. Other people will choose to put herd homes in, get the cows off, do cut and carry, go for those sort of systems, and also they can drop the nitrogen leaching and pathogen loss by 20 to 30%. Working with farmers in other catchments where we've got issues with pathogens getting through to the pippies and the food systems and the marine area. And these farmers are all wanting to talk about exactly what they're doing, how their business is working, how they're going to stop this connectivity happening, but they're being really honest about their business, their footprint, where they're going to go and where their businesses are going to go. And these guys do need support. A lot of them are trying to do the right thing, but we need good research and funding for transition. So, just a classic example of a Selwyn dairy farm, 850 cows with a pretty standard sort of a system. They will have their GMP or good management practices in now, but they have to drop a further 30%. What are they going to do? So option one, they can stay intensive, doing what they're doing, have a business as usual type system, but put in a loafing pad and a feed and a barn where they can house these cows and take them off the grass and get the urine patch off the grass. But the other issue is that they probably have to spend about $3 million. And the reality is this farmer, when we went through this scenario, he said, well, can I be sure that it's going to fix the lake?
And then how do I know that the policy's not going to change again? And that's the uncertainty that is what the lake is. The other option would be stop by 20%, reduce women feeds, use nitrogen a whole lot more strategically, get a lot more effort across the farm, and get more milk from fewer cows. It would be similar to what Lincoln's doing and achieve the same goals without the expensive infrastructure. So there's big choices, but people want to know that if we're going to spend $3 million, it's going to be right for the long term. Other people, this is Andrew and Nikki Watt from Ashburton, they're running a biological system. So using about 100 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, still give you very, very high production per cow, a lower stocking rate on stone units in the soils, leaching 40% less than the average on those soils, highly profitable business, significantly improved animal health and well-being, and they were the winners of the dairy business of the year 2 or 3 years ago. So it is possible, and if you run these businesses well, they can still not reduce their output and still be profitable, which is a good story.
We have to stop doing dumb things in dumb places, and that's intensive stocking on gravelly soils with these sort of scenarios, because you still get pathogen loss and nitrogen loss through the soils. and that makes its way to waterways. So some of these things that are still permitted activities might have to change. Okay, we've got to have cross-party discussion, like what Land Court's doing, and talking to people like me and Steve Carter and talking to Mike Joy, because it's not until we have these really open conversations about how all the different groups are feeling that we're going to be able to work together and solve the problems. And what we have to do is listen to the good guys, like Rick, who's been a leader for 25 years, and he's going to talk to you now about what he's doing in the Waikato.